Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Oxford Development Talks. I couldn't be more delighted that we're joined today by Professor Simukair Chigudu. There are very few people who could be more in demand at the moment from Simukair. Not only is his research focused on pandemics and was based on pandemics before COVID-19, but he's also one of the heroes, I might say, of the Roads Must Fall movement in Oxford. And so, as he put it to me, all of his worlds have collided and he's very, very in demand at the moment. So I'm delighted we booked him up before he was able to say no to this. Before I introduce him, I'm going to hand over to my co-host for today, Mia Simovic, who's president of the Oxford Society for International Development, to say a bit more about the series and what we've got coming up. Mia.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you, Simukair, for giving up your time and knowledge for us today. As Alex said, I'm the co-host for the Oxford Society for International Development, and we are a student-run group in Oxford, and we organise events, workshops for our students, usually undergraduates, and we try and kind of have really important conversations in the field of international development and beyond. Obviously, this term has posed a few challenges given the lockdown, so we've had to kind of move online, and we've done a really great podcast series and live stream series with the ODID, the Department of International Development, and we've had a really amazing range of voices represented. So far, we've had a great podcast with Rochelle Paley about challenging the white gaze of development in COVID-19. We've just recorded a podcast with Catherine Costello about the importance of human rights in COVID-19 and migration policy, which will be released very shortly, so that's really exciting. And we've got Professor Matthew Gibney on Monday talking about should we abolish immigration in COVID-19. So that'll be really exciting. And yeah, I think that's all said from me. So back to you, Alex, and thank you, Simukair.
Fantastic. I think Matthew would probably want me to say that he's going to talk about should we abolish immigration control rather than abolish immigration.
Thank you. Sorry, I mixed it up, I got confused.
Brilliant. Simukair, welcome. Simukair is Associate Professor of African Politics and a Fellow of St Antony's College here in Oxford. Simukair, a lot of your research is focused on the social politics of inequality in Africa. And what strikes me about your work is that you're really focused on the intersection between health, violence, and governance. One of Simukair's really seminal pieces of work is his book with Cambridge University Press, The Political Life of an Epidemic, Cholera, Crisis and Citizenship in Zimbabwe, based on his prize-winning DPhil thesis. It focused on Zimbabwe's cholera outbreak in 2008-9, one of the most serious cholera outbreaks in Africa's history, and it's placed Simukair in a position of being able to think historically about how pandemics play out politically in the African context. In addition to that, though, Simukair is also a trained medical doctor. He's one of these rare scholars who focuses on public health, but also has scientific and medical expertise. He was a medical doctor in the NHS for 3 years after training at Newcastle Medical School. And in addition to that, he's done research across Africa, not only in Zimbabwe, the focus of his book, but also Uganda, Tanzania, South Africa, even the Gambia. And as I said at the outset, Simukair is, I think, one of the heroes of the Roads Must Fall movement. And on behalf of many colleagues and students in Oxford, I think we're all really grateful for the work you're doing to make our university a better and more welcoming place. And Simukair has been writing in The Guardian, has been ever present in the media, and is a real superstar. So we are really lucky to have you at Oxford Development Talks. So I'll hand over to you. Simukair is going to speak for about half an hour. Then we'll open up to Q&A, and please feel free to enter questions in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to get to as many as we can. All yours. And if you'd like to share screen, that will bring up any slides you have.
Brilliant. Thank you for an incredibly generous introduction, Alex, and I'm looking forward to engaging in this discussion. So bear with me a moment while I share my screen. Okay, so the talk that I'm going to give this afternoon is called The Politics of Pandemics in Africa. Now, this is a little bit of a cop-out title. When Alex first invited me to take part in this discussion, I kind of identified a thematic area without a clear focus for discussion, and then somehow never got around to changing the title to reflect the slightly narrower focus that this talk is going to take. So what I'm hoping to do here is to, in a manner of speaking, impose a bit of order and structured thinking on how we might approach the question of pandemics in Africa, to understand a little bit about how epidemics kind of proceed and are structured in political thinking, and how this in various ways conflicts with reality. To do so, I'm going to begin by talking a bit about what I call here the dramaturgy of epidemics. This is an idea from historians of medicine who basically argue that epidemics tend to be narrated according to a dramatic arc. And I'll be explaining what I mean by that momentarily. I'm then going to situate and set the context for the COVID-19 drama in Africa by first reflecting on the idea of emerging diseases, looking at how this idea has played itself out in our contemporary pandemic, and how Africa has been situated in a wider global outbreak narrative. I'll briefly compare this then with some of the empirical realities as they're unfolding on the African continent, and how they defy some of the expectations that the overarching outbreak narrative might have us believe. And then, since this is a talk about development, I'm going to spend a bit of time thinking about the relationship between outbreak narratives and the sort of interdiscipline of development studies, before drawing from a few insights from my book to complete the talk. Okay, so let's begin with one of my favorite quotes from the historian Charles Rosenberg, who wrote in 1992 that epidemics start at a moment in time. They proceed on a stage limited in space and duration, following a plot line of increasing and revelatory tension, before moving to a crisis of individual and collective character, then drifting toward closure. In this sense, epidemics have a dramaturgy. And another of these dramaturgic aspects, epidemics take on the quality of a pageant. They mobilize communities to act out proprietary rituals that both incorporate and reaffirm fundamental social values and modes of understanding. So how might we understand this framing of a dramaturgy of epidemics with respect to COVID-19? So here I want to suggest that when we talk about a dramaturgy, we're talking about a way of talking or writing about epidemics that exists and is reproduced across a myriad range of discourses. These include scientific, political, social, media, and so on. In the case of this particular epidemic, we might begin our story back in May 1989. Because the dramaturgy of COVID-19, I think, could be traced back almost 3 decades to the notion of this category of emerging disease. So in 1989, at the National Institutes of Health and Rockefeller University, an international conference was convened, bringing together a number of scholars in human genetics, virology, and molecular biology. The keynote speaker on this occasion, Joshua Lederberg, who would later win the Nobel Prize in medicine and physiology, spoke about his growing concern about emerging viruses. Now, along with his colleagues, this meeting was brought together to talk about shared concerns over infectious agents such as HIV, Ebola, hantaviruses, as well as the worrying concern about antimicrobial resistant strains of older and more familiar pathogens. Now, from this sort of conference onwards, and over the course of the 1990s, new anxieties came to be expressed across a host of scientific, journalistic, and other public health outlets about the kind of convergence of both emerging diseases with national and international security concerns. The term emerging diseases, however, was a collective noun. It was a name given to the recrudescence of infectious diseases on a global scale, but it really functioned as a kind of descriptive shorthand of a complex set of real processes in the disease environment. Now, I'm not at all denying that there was substantial epidemiological evidence for the contention that some phenomenon that we call emerging diseases, exist and refer to real entities that had devastating effects on bodies and lives. But yet what I want to suggest here is that the category of emerging diseases is not an unproblematic reflection of changes that we see in the global burden of disease. We might in fact question any neat or direct correlation between this concept, this category of emergent disease, and an external referent object. So in a very basic sense, we could say that emerging diseases as a category doesn't coherently refer to a consistent set of pathogens, and rather it's a heuristic device to refer to a set of complicated epidemiological events. So in this respect, while certain specific diseases do emerge, there are no emerging diseases as such out there in the world. Sociologists, anthropologists, and historians of medicine could take this argument further and argue that the concept of emerging diseases was as much the reflection of social and discursive trends in the late 80s and early 90s to the present day, as it was a reflection of the natural or the biological world. And thus, in sociological parlance, we would be apt to describe emerging diseases as a social construction. But I'd like to go one step further still and argue that emerging diseases as a category could even be seen as a commodity. In other words, something that is traded, distributed, and circulated by specific actors according to specific pre-existing networks of circulation. They are consumed by specific sets of consumers and everywhere reconfigured through this process of production, circulation, and consumption. So what I'm trying to sketch out here is a picture or an idea of how a particular category of so-called emerging diseases emerges at a specific point in time by a group of scientists trying to make sense of a particular epidemiological phenomenon. And I'm trying to point out that this category is not fully coherent, but is fundamentally reflective of a particular set of anxieties about globalization and international security. Now, this is important because the cause or the idea of emerging diseases is circulated through what Priscilla Wald calls the outbreak narrative and propagated through various forms of civic advocacy. And this form of civic advocacy is exemplified by the book you can see on your screen here, Laurie Garrett's The Coming Plague. So Priscilla Wald's a literary scholar who kind of stitches together a kind of outbreak narrative that exists across these multiple genres of writing and that hinges on emerging diseases as a kind of as the source point for a global story about how pandemics spread. So the outbreak narrative is written in scientific, journalistic, and fictional accounts, and it follows a formulaic plot that begins with the identification of emerging diseases. It includes discussion of the global networks through which it travels and chronicles the epidemiological work that ends with the containment of emerging diseases. As I mentioned, Laurie Garrett's book, The Coming Plague, is exemplary of this dynamic, becoming itself a New York Times bestseller in 1994, and has since been one of the most influential works in shaping public and policy understandings of emerging diseases. It's also no coincidence that Garrett's book, The Coming Plague, mirrors an Atlantic article written by Robert Kaplan, The Coming Anarchy, which told of a story of increasing globalization and the risk that that poses to international social order. Now, outbreak narratives are tremendously flexible. They, while they follow a formulaic plot, they allow a wide variety of actors to adopt and mold specific parts of the outbreak narrative, emphasizing certain elements while downplaying others. But what kind of brings them together is the idea of epidemic disease as a kind of coherent and consistent self-contained ontology. And within this ontology comes a kind of moral economy and historical account explaining how and why we find ourselves gripped within pandemic circumstances, who the heroes and villains of pandemics are, where we might identify failures and triumphs. And it's a kind of universalizing template for understanding the interactions between human beings and the microbial world. And collectively, these features of the outbreak narrative conditions the possibility for response, and we see them having powerful hold within the wider realm of the institutions and actors that make up global health. Okay, so let's move a little bit from the abstract and concretize what I've been saying in relation to the outbreak narrative as it pertains to COVID-19 and situating Africa within this discourse. So, in the case of COVID-19, the outbreak narrative begins in the wet markets of Wuhan. For the Western observer, this kind of exotic and foreign location stokes anxieties about humanity at an ecological brink, in which unregulated interspecies mingling might tip us into collective destruction. From here, the drama intensifies as the virus spreads through the circuits of global modernity, such as the economy, trade, finance, and tourism, becoming an international security threat, as well as a parable about the dangers of our interconnected world. The narrative, of course, is never fully coherent, and it elicits contradictory reactions about the obsolescence and tenacity of borders, about the threat and benevolence of strangers, and about the failures and redemptive potential of medical science. But this part of the outbreaks, this is part of the outbreak narrative's potency in the sense that despite its inconsistency, it sets the terms of social dialogue and political debate. And Africa, in the COVID-19 outbreak narrative, is kind of discursively placed as the virus's final frontier, where we are assured it will yield untold damage. So, as we saw in the early stages of the outbreak, numerous headlines by journalists, policymakers, and scientists alike warned that the virus is a ticking time bomb, as you can see here, on a continent that's woefully ill-equipped to cope with the disease. And there's a kind of intermingling of legitimate concerns about weak health systems, densely populated urban centers, and a history of devastating epidemics on the continent, with more racist ideas about the primordial nature of African poverty and about the inability of African peoples and governments to respond to crisis with any ingenuity. What we also get here is a kind of contrast between the horrors of COVID-19 in the global north with its presumed trajectory in Africa. And this offers an important yet often ignored political question about how and why the suffering induced by communicable diseases is treated as unthinkable in one place and yet inevitable in another. And so what I'm trying to suggest here is that underlying all of this are some of the presupposed beats and narrative tropes of outbreak narratives more generally. So as I mentioned, the outbreak narrative embeds within itself a kind of narrative arc that ends with the redemptive potential of medical science. And, Laurie Garrett, amongst others, often talk about scientists racing against time to find the newest drug or vaccine that can rescue us from the threat of a dangerous microbe. The same has been true as I've been tracking journalistic and scientific reporting on COVID-19. There's a particularly compelling Guardian long read called It's a Razor's Edge We're Walking that looks at the race to develop a coronavirus vaccine and yet unwittingly follows all the presumptions and narrative tropes of outbreak narratives. Moreover, we're kind of presented with a world in which scientific breakthroughs are going to happen in the global north or in parts of the Far East, whereas Africa is kind of left as a blank canvas, a site where the virus will yield devastation and yet not a site of ingenuity, either in response or in scientific discovery. So how does all of this contrast then with the reality? Well, about a month ago, on the 22nd of May, the COVID-19 pandemic reached a major milestone in Africa as more than 100,000 confirmed cases were logged on the continent. The virus has now spread to every country in Africa, with the WHO saying that despite the disease or the epidemic crossing this threshold, Africa still seems to be following a different pathway to what we've seen in the global north or increasingly in South America. So case numbers, as you can see on the screen, have not fully grown yet at the same exponential rates in Africa as they have elsewhere in the world. We have a total number of cases in Africa of about 306,000, which again you'll see that the whole of Africa has the same number of confirmed cases as the United Kingdom, more or less. Total death rates in Africa are hovering at less than 10,000, at about 8,000. And so this really is a radically different picture, at least at the moment, from what we might have expected, looking at the projections of catastrophe that were presented to us in the early stages of the COVID-19 outbreak narrative. But it's crucial here to underscore the fact that we shouldn't be complacent or smug in our analysis. Cases continue to rise in Africa, and there are hints that the caseload might potentially still increase exponentially, since it took up to 52 days for the continent to reach its first 10,000 cases, and yet only 11 days to move from 30,000 to 50,000. And more importantly, the pandemic remains a major threat to the continent's health systems, with WHO models predicting that if current containment measures fail, even with a low number of cases requiring hospitalization, the medical capacity in much of the continent could quickly be overwhelmed. So how do we account for Africa following a different pathway, to use the WHO's terms? There's a few different factors that we might look to. One factor would be demographic account, where we know that Africa is the youngest continent, with more than 60% of the continent's population under the age of 25. We also know that older adults have a significant risk of developing severe illness from infection with coronavirus. So in Europe, we've seen that nearly 95% of deaths have occurred in those who are aged 60 years or older. But I don't think we should take this youth dividend in Africa for granted, as it might be offset by various forms of comorbidity, including things like HIV infection, for example, or malnutrition. Another factor that's been posited for the difference, or for why Africa's followed a different path, is a largely geographic explanation. I write here slightly tongue-in-cheek that the political scientist Jeffrey Herbst, in his sort of canonical work of African politics, State and Power, argued that across Africa, states have struggled to broadcast their power across vast geographies with relatively low population density. You know, once you move away from centralized urban capitals. So we might see something vaguely analogous here of a virus unable, in a manner of speaking, to broadcast its own power outside of capital cities. A third form of explanation lies in the forms of preemptive lockdowns that occurred across much of the continent, where numerous countries shut down borders or closed down international flights, implemented social distancing measures at a time when they had very few or even no cases. And this is partly an artifact of the epidemic curve having been slower in the African continent. And again, all of this goes to defy some of the narrative tropes that lie within the outbreak narrative, or some of the presumptions that have underpinned the idea of emerging diseases. And finally, a more speculative account has suggested that given that high numbers of the African population have been immunized against tuberculosis through the BCG vaccine, that this may confer some residual immunity against coronavirus. But again, this is largely speculative. So all of this leaves us with actually quite a radically uncertain scientific picture. From what I've been able to read across different models, projections, numerous kinds of assumptions are going in to try to predict what the trajectory that the coronavirus will ultimately take within Africa. And I think that there are kind of three overarching scenarios that that are kind of all posited and all suggested by scientific models at present. So one model is that Africa still is in a kind of pre-peak phase of the epidemic. In other words, we're still at the beginning, and it's only a matter of time between the cumulative incidence of cases increases exponentially. Another account of events is that we're post-peak, that Africa has in fact already seen a peak in its caseload, but it was just a relatively low peak. And what we're going to see over the coming months is a steady decline. I think the new evidence that's coming out rightly, cautions us to be wary of this interpretation. And a third framework is that coronaviruses or COVID-19 is already endemic in Africa, such that the number of new cases or the reproductive number when situated or multiplied against those who are susceptible comes to a figure of about 1. In other words, the epidemic or the virus isn't spreading at a rate fast enough for exponential growth, but is not moving slow enough to burn itself out. Okay, so what does all of this mean then for how we might think about it in relation to the study of development? I think one big issue is that in the early stages of the pandemic, a kind of dominant model of logic emerged for how the world should respond to coronavirus, that we all became familiar with, the idea of flattening the curve. And this basically presupposed that health systems were going to be under intense capacity strains if they didn't if the epidemic was allowed to spread naturally through the population. Therefore, social distancing measures would be necessary to slow down the rate of spread of infection, therefore reduce the number of cases that require hospitalization, and therefore reduce the risk of overwhelming health systems. This kind of model developed in the global north was predicated on the idea that economies would be resilient enough to absorb a kind of public health shock to the suppression of economic activity. But yet, as we know, this model can't possibly work across the world, given the wide range of historical, political, and economic circumstances that different countries are having to endure. So across the African continent, if you have situations where the burden of the virus itself, of the coronavirus or COVID-19 cases, is already relatively low, and yet you've got very large informal economies or people who are subsisting, a kind of economic shutdown comes with its own existential risks. Moreover, what we see sort of in empirical reality across Africa are a wide variety of possible and actual responses, many of which are led by a host of different actors, not only the state. And so it seems to me that perhaps what's more important here than simply following the kind of dominant model of public health and economic response to the outbreak that's existed, particularly in the global north, is thinking about some of the tensions and trade-offs that exist in different contexts between, say, the demands of livelihoods and livelihood poverty versus public health measures such as social distancing, trying to appreciate the complexity of state-led versus community-led responses, and crucially, from within health systems, realizing that this notion of protecting health system capacity belies the fact that a lot of medical care is being delivered in quite an improvised sort of way, and that the concerns that might exist, say, in the UK and in the US around respiratory support, say, through mechanical ventilation, are subordinate to other concerns. So in Zimbabwe, the country I know best, many of the doctors who've been responding to this outbreak there are thinking in quite improvised ways about forms of delivering respiratory support, given a relative lack of access to mechanical ventilation, as well as inadequate provisions of personal protective equipment or PPE. So to sort of zoom out for a moment and head back to some of the more theoretical aspects of this talk, I think that we need to take these outbreak narratives seriously, but also challenge and complicate them because they gloss over a huge amount of context, and this could potentially have quite deadly consequences. Moreover, outbreak narratives create what scholars call an anticipatory regime. In other words, they condition us to expect catastrophe in Africa. They predict a future that may or may not arrive, and yet which is always uncertain, and yet we're told is necessarily coming. Think of Laurie Garrett's notion of the coming plague, and therefore always demanding a response oriented to an impending pandemic catastrophe. But anticipatory regimes also serve specific kinds of political purposes. They replace actors and institutions with impersonal forces and tend to relocate pandemic response into international realms and based on a model of development for Africa that's already premised on the notion of African failure. So what kind of emerges from all of this is a particular sort of genre of pandemic response that focuses on disease exceptionalism, where entire African health systems become oriented to single pathogens. So now the debate is about COVID-19. On previous occasions, it's been about Ebola, HIV, and so on. And in part, it gives us a little bit of a peek or an account as to why philanthrocapitalists like Bill Gates are so powerful and influential. His entire sort of foundation has been predicated on the control or even eradication of certain key infectious diseases. And yet we know from the deeper history of molecular biology and global security anxieties, this need or this drive or this impetus to control pathogens comes from a notion of emerging diseases, which itself is a kind of social category and not necessarily an empirical reality. And it leaves us with this question of, you know, if we're so focused on disease exceptionalism, what are the implications for systems and politics and empirical realities on the ground? So what I'd like to suggest then is, rather than thinking about epidemic disease as having a kind of single or coherent ontology that then sort of comes to fruition within this paradigm of emerging diseases, we might instead think of epidemics as having multiple ontologies. In other words, epidemics are many different things at the same time, which is the kind of one of the major theoretical takeaways of my book on the politics of cholera in Zimbabwe. And in that work, I try to show that, yes, epidemics are biological phenomena. They are infectious diseases that occur in a given population in excess of normal expectancy, but they are always simultaneously social phenomena spreading in populations in ways that are both socially patterned and socially contingent. Epidemics are historical phenomena. They don't emerge ex nihilo, nor are they just artifacts of kind of a primordial origin, as the outbreak narrative suggests, but there are multi-scalar political economic processes that bring about epidemics, and these tend to be extended, occurring over a period of time. And finally, epidemics are always necessarily political phenomena, including the mere fact of declaring something an epidemic or a pandemic is a political decision, as well as the question of what forms of resources and response should come to it. And I think this helps sort of contextualize the idea that science, contra the outbreak narrative, cannot necessarily map a way out of epidemics, but is only a tool that exists alongside political decisions and calculations about how to respond. So just to wrap this up then, what I've tried to point out in this presentation is that yes, an outbreak narrative exists as a discursive and social construction and holds powerful sway within the global health imagination, and that this obscures perhaps the real nature of risks and tragedies that exist in Africa as they do anywhere else in the world. We don't, in fact, have a clear blueprint for dealing with this pandemic, and we need to caution against the idea that a vaccine or a pill is an immediate or inevitable solution on its own. And as epidemics are predicted, as well as the kind of radical uncertainty that exists as to the true trajectory of an epidemic, in this case, whether Africa is pre, post COVID-19 pandemic, I think what we can usefully do is turn our attention to deconstructing the taken for granted assumptions about how the pandemic will play out in Africa. And all of this then should help to sort of complicate or denaturalize the idea of the threat of a microbe, and to think instead about the conditions that create epidemics, before ultimately encouraging us to reimagine the forms of political and economic organization of social life that I think COVID-19 demands of us. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Simukair, that was fascinating. Thank you so much. For anyone listening who wants to ask a question, please feel free to type questions into the chat box or the Q&A box. But while we're waiting, I think both Mia and I want to ask you just a couple of questions. And if I might begin, Simukair, I suppose that one of the key takeaways from this is that there's no inherent meaning that comes from the science or the epidemiology about what an outbreak means. It's conferred with social and political meaning. And you used the line, herbs for microbes, to kind of describe the way in which Jeffrey Herbst talks about sort of geographical determinism. But I suppose one thing one might say is, in a way, aspects of your characterization might be thought of as, say, sort of Ferguson for pandemics. There's an element of the sort of imposition of a single sort of global one-size-fits-all gaze that assumes that the solutions portrayed by the World Health Organization that work in Europe need to be imposed from the outside on the African continent in a way that's blind to the differences and that different pathway that's playing out in Africa. And that kind of top-down imposition comes out very strongly. But I'm also wondering about the sort of, as it were, other side of the coin, which is, you mentioned commodification, the idea that this discursive framing creates arguably opportunities, a commodity that can be played out to serve interests and serve power. If I might sort of flip that and ask you about the sort of Bayart and Ellis of pandemics, how is it that you see particular African leaders or African political elites using the discursive framing of the pandemic to serve domestic or international interests? So on the one hand, I think you've really fleshed out for us the way in which the narrative of the outbreak serves a one-size-fits-all international agenda. How does it play out to also serve national political agendas on the continent?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question and really well put. What I'm going to do is I'll talk a little bit about some of my earlier work just to give this a basis, and then maybe we can speculate a bit about what it means at present. So, you know, one of the things that we saw during Zimbabwe's 2008 cholera outbreak was Robert Mugabe's government, particularly his Minister of Information at the time, Sikanyiso Ndlovu, coming out and saying that cholera was racist, terrorist, biological warfare launched by the West to undermine African sovereignty. Now, of course, what's happening there, I mean, this was totally ludicrous, and many people in Zimbabwe, many journalists at the time were just shocked that such words could come out of a minister's mouth. But I think what it told us was sort of what you're describing, that epidemics can become a sort of discursive terrain in which different political contests take place that actually have very little to do with the epidemic, either as a social event or as a biological phenomenon. The example I've given there is particularly stark, but it can be more insidious or hidden than that. So colleagues I know in Sudan have been talking about some of the pressures that the Sudanese government has been under in its mismanaging of the economy, and are sort of seizing on COVID-19 now as an opportunity to blame those economic failures and weaknesses on the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, both domestically and internationally. And I suspect that as we look across the continent towards different examples, situating them within their specific historical and social circumstances, there are different kinds of narrative entrepreneurship that are being used by political leaders to serve an array of agendas. So it's really quite intense and terse terrain on which politics takes place.
I really like that idea of narrative entrepreneurs, that it's as you said earlier on, it's a malleable discourse that could be used on a context-specific basis to serve certain agendas and inculcate power in interesting ways. And I guess we see that globally. We can see sort of Trumps and Bolsonaros doing that on the global stage, and we can see that playing out differently in different countries where it serves particular interests.
Absolutely.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to briefly say, and I think obviously Trump is the archetype of this, and we don't need to discuss it in detail, but I think that the kind of geopolitical tensions that have existed between the US and China have not only collided over the outbreak, but have also, served as a premise to reframe and to challenge different anxieties about what globalization represents, including some of the attacks that have been leveled against the WHO.
So Simukair, I think I also have a question for you. This is more general about kind of epidemics in general, and also on an international level. I was going to ask about how you've talked a lot about kind of discourses and kind of, I guess, macro scale, kind of top-down approaches, but also epidemics have a very embodied element to them. They're lived through, people suffer and die from them, and also there have been, particularly even in the UK, there have been failings on the state's part to really provide for the people who need it most, such as providing PPE for people working in care homes, leading to deaths, etc., etc. So I just quite like to ask you about how you think epidemics affect kind of how people articulate their own political subjectivities, the relationship between the citizen and the state when the state has failed to kind of provide and care for them. So.
Yeah, that's also an excellent question, and I think one of the things that will be interesting as lockdowns begin to ease and research can resume is trying to do that very work, trying to understand social and collective experiences of living through such a strange and terrifying time. And I know some people have been doing this work looking at sort of pandemic narratives and diaries as people have been documenting them. I think that something that I find really useful as a kind of intellectual tool to think with is the work done by the anthropologist Shireen Hamdi. And Shireen Hamdi talks about, she uses this idea of political etiologies. And in her work, she spends time carefully and patiently talking through the experience of illness, in her case, kidney failure patients in Egypt, to understand how people make sense of the origins of disease. And she's sort of struck by how often that is affixed to politics. So her paper, When the State and Your Kidneys Fail, kind of captures that idea. My own work with cholera in the 2008 cholera outbreak was spent talking to people about how the epidemic infiltrated lives, shaping both citizens' view of the state, but also their interpretation of where Zimbabwe was at that particular moment of political history. Now we're getting hints of that the world over. In the UK, the outbreak came at a kind of interesting time with a relatively newly formed government and the kind of emergence of a different kind of political settlement and voter realignment in Britain. And yet all of the kind of tropes and ideas and work that's been done by the Conservative government in the years preceding around austerity and the underfunding of social care is now kind of coming back with a vengeance. And it'll be fascinating both to explore and to think about the extent to which individuals in their daily lives, situate these very, very localized experiences, of pain, suffering, and loss, as well as the politics of care that's around them and how much that is interpreted within a wider political prism. In other words, there's a tremendous degree of contextual and historical specificity to how those subjectivities are formed.
Thank you.
We've got quite a few questions coming in the Q&A boxes from the audience. Yelena Pringle asks, could you comment on some of the different political responses by governments across the continent? How does Tanzania, for example, fit into the wider picture of what's happening more generally in Africa? And I know, Simukair, you said you're really keen to sort of not generalize across the continent, but kind of recognize particular social and historical and cultural context. but I suppose Yolana's asking, could you give a couple of examples to situate some of these ideas?
Sure. I mean, it's difficult for me to answer that, in part because, and this is partly why I've decided to analyze the kind of top-down framing, because at this moment, that's something that to me as a scholar and an analyst is very readily available at hand, and I felt I could do justice to. I think that responses across different countries, I mean, it's a huge, variety. I don't know enough about the specifics of the Tanzania case, and other scholars know better, so I'd be hesitant to comment on that, particularly. I think that, one can sort of comfortably say that certain countries have adopted a much more aggressive form of lockdown, often enforced by the security sector. So one might think here of Kenya, to some extent, what's happening in South Africa to a great extent. South Africa is complicated because there's a kind of merging both of the security sector and various forms of legislation that increase the emergency powers of the state. You've got countries like my own, Zimbabwe, which don't really have a coherent model and have kind of been playing follow the leader. Malawi's done a sort of similar thing where their initial lockdown statement was quite literally a sort of carbon copy of what had happened in Uganda, but with the with the press statement substituting Uganda for Malawi, until eventually the Supreme Court kind of turned over the lockdown order because it hadn't been thought through enough with its economic consequences. So we're seeing a number of different models and examples following through. I suppose an instructive way of going about thinking about this from a sort of comparative level is thinking about some of the most densely interconnected countries. Those that are the most integrated into the global economy: Egypt, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, as regional hubs, Ethiopia as well, and thinking through the different ways in which they've thought about this. Because I think that those trends will look a bit different to some of the countries that are either more landlocked or interior, and have been hit with the epidemic curve much later. The other theme that lurks in the background in all of this is the question of, if you like, medical pluralism as well as heterodox medical beliefs. So whether that's different forms of concoction or herbal medicine or things of that nature that are sort of posited as miracle treatments for the pandemic. And again, interpreting that is difficult, but those are often, what is often at stake are different contests over power and knowledge, and ways of exhibiting or broadcasting authority.
So a question has come in from someone, and they say, thank you so much for the talk. And they found your point about denaturalizing the threat of microbes fascinating. They are asking, could you say a bit more about that in terms of human and non-human relations? They've seen some pieces that try to desecuritize the virus and try to situate it within a wider context of how humans and non-humans are interrelated and interdependent.
Sure. I mean, again, it's a complex question. I mean, I think that there is a kind of fragile ecological balance that keeps coming up as both as a trope, but also as a reality, whether, that's the wet markets in China or deforestation in West Africa that may have led to the Ebola outbreak and so on. I think that there's important scientific work that needs to understand essentially, and political work, of course, some of the limits and contingencies of human attempts to exercise mastery over nature. Because in part that's a subtext of the story here. The idea that nature is entirely subordinate to human innovation and political economic purposes. Because it inevitably creates these unexpected contingencies and new forms of interspecies interaction. This isn't my specialism, but I take a lot of cautionary advice from the work that Timothy Mitchell does in his seminal essay, Can the Mosquito Speak?, that tries to revisit and explain the 1942 malaria outbreak in Egypt, as he shows how dam building, not totally sort of kind of reformed an entire landscape and changed people's relationship to the Nile. And one of the consequences of that was unleashing a kind of new breed of mosquitoes and exposing more susceptible people to the malaria parasite. But the point here being that this assumption, particularly the sort of age of the Anthropocene, that human beings can continue to exercise mastery over nature is kind of a dangerous and deeply troubling one, and requires much more subtle ecological thinking.
Thank you.
There's another question from Mariah Sudi, who says, "Hi, Simukair. Do you think COVID-19 specifically has taken a very political narrative? So is there something about this pandemic as distinct from other pandemics?" And she says, to be specific, in the East African region, for instance, police violence in Kenya in enacting curfews and lockdowns, Magufuli in Tanzania and the coming elections and his decision to not close down the country for a while. Does COVID-19, or perhaps the discursive construction of COVID-19, offer a different set of political opportunities compared to, say, cholera in Zimbabwe or other epidemics?
So what I would say is that COVID-19 is exemplary rather than exceptional. The fact that it's a global pandemic, of a scale that, not only of a scale, but also of a kind of temporal compression that many of us haven't lived through, has just brought into much sharper focus, I think, something that's true of all epidemics, which is that every phase and aspect of an epidemic, from origins to the pattern of spread, to patterns of vulnerability, the difference of who lives and who dies, to result, response, and rehabilitation, is always political. I think that now what we're seeing is just a compression of that because of how fast the pandemic has spread and the different corners of the globe it's affected. But if you're to look at the history of HIV/AIDS in Africa, for example, many, it's a different set of issues, but many of the controversies about the appropriate models of response, about how it can be treated and cured, we have in 2007, Yahya Jammeh in the Gambia saying that he had discovered 7 herbs from the Quran that could treat HIV. Back in 2000, there was the whole controversy of Thabo Mbeki's sort of heterodox stance on the relationship between the virus, the human immunodeficiency virus, and the syndrome of AIDS. There's so many iterations of pandemic politics, but I think what many of us haven't seen is these things converging to such sharp relief at such a global scale all at once. And in that sense, it's exemplary rather than exceptional.
So I think we've got time for one more question. This is a question from Richard. He's asking, have you worked in local African contexts where there are different alternative narratives to COVID-19 or other epidemics, which differ from the universal one that you've described?
Sure. So obviously on this, in this particular pandemic, I've been locked down in Oxford, so I haven't done the kind of on the ground field work that would typically go into the sorts of research I'm inclined toward. What I would say is, I guess there's a couple of things here. Let me contrast two different stories. So one is that the work that I had done on cholera in Zimbabwe, the kind of grounded narratives were really, really multifarious, and there were different ways in which people, say in the high density townships out in Harare's metropolitan area, the capital city, which were epicenters of the cholera epidemic. People there found different narrative tropes of blaming the ZANU-PF government for what had happened. They didn't all follow the same line. So some people said the government had failed because it couldn't procure appropriate chemical treatment for the water supply. Others said that that the government had bought fake chemicals from China, which couldn't clean the water treatment appropriately, and therefore cholera was able to spread. Others said that cholera was deliberately sprayed into the townships to kill people who had voted for the opposition. And there's a kind of convergence of either a vision of a sinister state capable of harming its citizens, either deliberately or through malign neglect. And so when I was looking at that, the question I was really asking myself is not so much about the content of these narratives, but what they tell us about what is socially conceivable. And in a sense, that mirrors the top-down image I was discussing before, that say, for instance, the early predictions that COVID-19 was going to be a catastrophe in Africa gains currency and is reproduced across all of these different publications because it's socially conceivable, regardless of what empirical reality is. So I think as sort of social scientists, it's constantly trying to pull the veil behind what these different tropes tell us about how people think about reality. The last thing I'd say is in this particular outbreak, trying to track what's been happening in Zimbabwe, I think one of the most interesting things to me has been following the response of Zimbabwean doctors in conversation with Zimbabwean doctors in the diaspora, because there's a particular WhatsApp platform, an organization that is trying to bring together a disparate medical community of Zimbabweans to respond to the outbreak. And this is fascinating, not only because it's sort of happening invisible from and alongside some of the other forms of response that are more widely publicized. It's a different form of how diaspora engages with home, to I think many of the prevailing narratives of diaspora politics. But it also betrays, and as the discussions in these forums sort of indicate, it betrays a certain sense of giving up on what the government is capable of doing on its own. And therefore, ingenuity lies in different forms of transnational networking. And I think that that's kind of an interesting and understudied phenomena that I think is something else that this outbreak is bringing up that isn't captured at all by the conventional beats of the outbreak narrative.
Brilliant, Simukair. We're coming to our time. I think one of the things I find really fascinating about the contribution you make to all of us is to really challenge and question the kind of scientific universalism or scientific determinism of a pandemic. I mean, I feel sort of intellectually liberated just from hearing you talk, to kind of consider that there isn't a scientific determinism. There is a social and political world there. And so even in the UK, when we hear about people saying, well, that's science, but that's politics, you blur the line between those. And you highlight that for us, politics is everywhere, power is everywhere. I also find it really fascinating that you are both a scientist and a social scientist. And that adds real credibility to the arguments you can make, because I imagine if someone who was only a social scientist came along and said, so much of this is socially constructed, the scientists would be able to come along and say, no, there's a science behind this, but you're also a scientist. So hearing from you, balancing science and the way in which you can understand the science and the epidemiology, but also recognize that the power and the politics, I think, is really insightful for all of us, not only those of who work in Africa, but much more broadly. So that's a long-winded way of saying thank you very much for a fascinating, brilliant and inspiring talk. So on behalf of ODID, thank you very much. And Mia?
Hi. Yes, absolutely. To mirror exactly what Alex just said, it was fantastic to hear your knowledge and your opinions on this. So yeah, from behalf of the students and Oxford, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Simukair. And take care for all of you listening. Thanks for joining us. And the next and for now final Oxford Development Talks will be next Monday with Matthew Gibney on the topic of should we abolish immigration control. Thanks very much. Bye.